Today's seminar speaker is Dr. Lord Ameyaw. He is the program leader for regional and community forestry here in SNR. He has a Bachelor of Science from the Agricultural Technology from the University of Developmental Studies in Ghana. He has a Master of Science in Rural Sociology from Auburn University and a PhD in Environmental and Forest Science from University of Washington. Before coming to UNL, Dr. Ameyaw served as National Agroforester for USDA and RCS. Dr. Ameyaw's research focuses on agroforestry, particularly the interface of research management and social dimensions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ameyaw.
Can everyone hear me? All right. I have history with this room, so I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me all right. All right. Thanks for the intro. By the way, kind of made me feel bigger than I wanted to feel. But anyways, I'm glad to be here. Glad to get this opportunity to speak to you guys about some stuff that I've been working on for a couple of years now. Since I joined, a couple of years. It's not been that much. It's 3 years. Yeah, compared to some of you who have been here like for, decades. Anyways, I've been involved in a couple things. And my plan today, because we don't have enough time to go through everything, but a couple of things that I have done and I've kind of changed my plan a little bit from the very initial one that I wanted to go with for this talk. And it's just because of some interesting encounters I've had with folks around campus about what agroforestry is. And I've got a lot of responses like, agro what? Agro what? And so, I was like, okay, I know that folks probably in the room will be familiar with what agroforestry is, and that's fine. So we're gonna do a quick recap of agroforestry, like take it like agroforestry 101, more or less. But I'll breeze through that very quickly. Then we'll look at a couple of studies that I have been involved in. So involved in meaning there are other people who were also who also took part in those studies. So we'll look at that. Then hopefully there's enough time. I don't go blah 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 too long, and we have enough time to ask some questions and just get some things straightened out if there are any things like that. So I'll start this way. Thought this was the new toy that was supposed to be working very well, but okay. I'm not sure. I put it on. Okay, one more time. It was working right before. Excuse me. Yeah, it's already supposed to be. Okay, it's not even working here. Wow. Yeah, technology is always like your best friend when it comes to things like this. Right before I started, it was working okay. It's almost as if it was frozen or something. Okay, let me see. Okay.
Does it work now?
It works. Okay. All right. Okay. So as I mentioned, Agroforestry 101. Then I'll take you all through some recent research and then some way forward, or just basically whatever we are going to talk about will be like the way forward here. Before I get started, I usually, for a couple of years, I think two years now, I've been teaching this agroforestry spring mini session course. So the first time was 3 weeks. This recent year, it was just 2 weeks of it. I don't know how many weeks is going to be this coming spring, but another 3. Okay, so 3 weeks of agroforestry, and we are just going to delve into intro, agroforestry and just all the practices, some, bits and pieces of agroforestry that's very essential to know. And so for all those, especially students here or those online, if you're interested, you can sign up for that course. It's going to be asynchronous. So, you can basically just sign on and just do what you're supposed to do any time of the day that you want. So just bear that in mind. I'll have some course posters or something like that sent around. Send around very, very soon on that. Okay, let's get started. Okay, let's define what agroforestry is. And, oh boy. Okay, so there are several definitions of agroforestry to pick from, especially for those who are interested. If you go online, you find several of them. I like two, personally, for some reasons that I don't know. But it's kind of shaped my thinking about what agroforestry is and what agroforestry is not. And I'll share those two with you guys. But the first is an intensive land management system that optimizes the benefits from the biological interactions. So we are talking about interactions here created when trees or sometimes shrubs are deliberately combined with crops and or livestock. That is my first definition that I like. Here's the second one. And as we go on, you come to a realization why I've chosen those two. So here's the second one. It's the intentional integration of trees or shrubs with crop and all animal production to create what? Environmental, economic, and social benefits, kind of towing the lines of what sustainability. And I like to use this image a lot. I think very soon those who are very close to me will maybe give me a name or something like that for this figure. But I really like to use it to explain what agroforestry is. So we are talking about what? Trees, livestock, crops in some kind of combination as agroforestry. And of course, there are benefits to doing that. We'll go through all that. But basically, what this diagram tells us is that there is that sweet spot. I mean, those who know the tree trade-off triangle, scientists really love triangles, by the way. But there's usually that mid spot, that sweet spot that we always try to get to when it comes to some of these practices and terms. At least conceptually, we think about it that way. But by virtue of that, it means that there are several levels of these three elements that we can have in combination at any point in time. With trees being kind of the how should I even put it here? So it's trees plus livestock, trees plus crops, or trees plus crops and livestock in some kind of combination. So looking at it this way means that we can have several levels of it going on. And it's a good thing to look at it that way, but I personally think also that it kind of opens up Pandora's box with regards to what exactly is agroforestry and what it's not. Because I can be here and still be talking about agroforestry in some regard. And that's been a very big problem with agroforestry. But one thing to note, however, is that agroforestry is, so if this will work for us, is intentional, as you've seen from the definition. It doesn't necessarily just occur in nature. It's intentional. It needs to be created. It's intensive. You can't just like maybe plant your trees and your crops and just leave your livestock and that's it. You have to intensively manage it. Then it's interactive. All the various parts of it are being connected and integrated also. So you have different systems or different land use systems that you're combining, and there's some kind of integration happening. All right. So yeah, let's still try to review what agroforestry is proper. We know this part of the world, we know agriculture very well, and we know the various benefits that we get from it. So of course, crops, but there's also other things that we are also interested in. I mean, in the landscape, and to some level, we are interested in reducing risk from weather events in this part of the world. I think that's important. And also, we are thinking about wildlife, soil issues, income diversification, and in recent times, carbon. It's become a big thing these days. Then, of course, we're also interested in water quality protection and biological pest control. But unfortunately, in those kind of agricultural systems or typical monoculture, type agricultural systems, you're looking at, the very first or main ingredient or main item on the list here, which is crop production. And you basically are at the mercy of all the other events, all the other things that you are looking at in terms of benefits. They are very reduced. Of course, if you have 2 crops or more, you can talk about some diversification, but it's not that significant. And risk management in general is always like very difficult in these kind of monoculture systems. All right. So let's look at traditional forestry. So in our traditional forest, of course, a forested system, we are talking about timber. We are talking about non-wood products or non-timber products, and trees. So of course, carbon storage as well, and trees help with both water quality and biodiversity conservation, as we know, and we just love the sight of trees as well. So in our traditional forest, chances are that we are considering one of these as benefits, or we are getting all those benefits as a suite. So if you kind of superimpose it on the benefits that I talked about for crop production, you realize that if you introduce the trees into those agricultural landscapes, you will still get some crop production, probably not to the same level as our typical monoculture systems. But of course, there are other benefits that you look at also. We look at risk reduction. If you have trees in your system, it actually helps reduce some of these weather events, the impact of those. Of course, we have wildlife habitats as well. We have trees in there, microclimates, soil health enhancement, and of course, income diversification also there. And carbon sequestration, which is a huge thing in recent times. Of course, some water quality protection and some biological pest control also can be worked there. So if you marry these two, basically that is what, of course, we can go in depth, very detailed with it. But on a very simple scale, I would say that this is what agroforestry is. Now, in my next slide, so I've thrown lots of terms in here, and I just put them in some kind of a cycle just to show all those 4 I's that I talked about. Now, what you realize is that there are several things going on. When we talk about agroforestry, there are several aspects of it that we can consider. We can talk about, communities. We can talk about livelihoods. Of course, we're talking about forestry, some innovations and whatnots. And all these are critical, to agroforestry. I underline them, and just not to say that one is more important than the other, just to show you guys that agroforestry entails some level of all these concentrations, all these things that we are supposed to focus on. But it also throws in one, especially now that we talk about climate change. There's that bit of agroforestry that people hail as the savior of climate change, and so everybody should do agroforestry. Agroforestry is an option. It's an option. It's not the savior. And I always like to emphasize that because there are several good options out there, and agroforestry is one of those options. And so from the scientific point of view and a practical point of view, we are trying to encourage its use, but not to say that other environmental measures or strategies, conservation strategies are also bad. Agroforestry is one of those good options to use on farms. So that's one misconception, and we'll look at a couple of them. Okay, history of agroforestry, I'll quickly breeze through this. I like to look at this from a very biblical like standpoint, and that's personal. But from Genesis 2, 8 to 9, and I'll read it very quickly. Now the Lord God had planted a garden in what? The east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. And the Lord God made all kinds of trees grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. We can end it there. But for me, this is the foundation of agroforestry. So agroforestry has been around since the creation of man. That is my personal viewpoint. All right, but let's look at how it gradually got to be some kind of a mainstay in civilization, more or less. You know, of course, we all started out being what, hunters and gatherers. Then at some point we decided that, okay, we want our food close to us now. Okay, so we don't want to roam or keep roaming for our food anymore. So we'll have our home gardens. And what were home gardens? You know, home gardens had trees, they had like foodstuffs, and you know, all the components that I described agroforestry as. You know, so it kind of started in that kind of Neolithic age or the agricultural revolution, and where we had home gardens. Then it kind of moved on to the Middle Ages, where we had shifting cultivation, which people really frown against, but was kind of one of the foundational systems that created the kind of agroforestry system that we have right now, where like people, you know, basically cut down trees and free up the land, you know, for agricultural purposes. Of course, they did some burning in there, but they relied very heavily on natural regeneration, basically to move the systems back to secondary forest and basically go in that cycle. So this is not used here in the United States, unless maybe I'm wrong. I've not heard of any, you know, shifting cultivation systems being used here in the US. But that also tells you something, that agroforestry has been used extensively in some areas of the world. And that is actually true. In the tropics, you have a lot of agroforestry systems there, and they have very different objectives, and we can go very in-depth with that as well. And that will lead us into one of the misconceptions. This is me going ahead of myself, but there's always that perception that, you know, once I go into agroforestry, it's a permanent move from agricultural lands to forest lands, which is not the case. That is not what agroforestry does. So, of course, there is some amount of land that will be changed from, you know, growing crops to growing trees. All right, but I'm talking about, you know, the entire landscape level. It's not being changed from agricultural lands to forest lands. So let's just get that misconception out of the way. All right, so benefits of agroforestry. There are several benefits of agroforestry, and we can spend the rest of the time just talking about those benefits. And so at the end of my talk, I'm sure you're going to go like, so why aren't we using more agroforestry? But numerous benefits, and I think you saw just a snapshot of those already. But you know, right from, you know, just firewood, you know, food and medicine, shade, nitrogen fixation, soil erosion. We went through all that. But this is that misconception that I was talking about. Now, in the United States, it's a fairly recent strategy, and I use that. I have to explain what I mean by that. So, and it's one of the problems that I've already talked about, like what exactly is agroforestry? If you trace it very carefully, especially these indigenous and tribal communities have been using those kind of systems, you know, since time immemorial. And all the records that we have indicate that they were using agroforestry to some extent. Then later on, you know, these traditional agricultural practices became a thing in the tropics, you know, kind of warm tropical areas of the United States. Then right around the Dust Bowl era, we those in this part of the world, we know what that means. The Prairie States Forestry Project basically spawned the era of agroforestry in the lower 48, if you want to call it that way. But that's really what gave that impetus for agroforestry to go, I would say, like mainstream in the United States. So you can read more on that. The Nebraska Forest Service has a very good write-up of all of this and this project. All right, so there are 5 agroforestry breaks down into 5 systems that are streamlined here in the United States, and outside the United States, there's a lot more. You saw that triangle, which meant that we can have different combinations. But in terms of recognized practices, there are 5 of them. There are silvopasture windbreaks, which we are very familiar with, riparian buffers, forest farming, and alley cropping. So basically, we are in all these systems. You are trying to put the right trees in the right location for the right reason. I will quickly describe all the practices, then I'll move on to what I've been doing some time now with other folks. So alley cropping is just like single or multiple rows of trees, and in between those rows of trees, there's space for some agricultural crop. It could be anything from just pasture or some forages or agricultural crops, if you will. Forest farming is basically freeing up some kind of overstory canopy just to admit some sunlight onto the forest floor so that other crops or agricultural crops mostly or specialty crops could be grown under the forest canopy. That's forest farming. And riparian forest buffer, as the name says, it's just basically plantings along riparian zones and water bodies or water courses. Then we also have, I believe, silvopasture. So silvopasture is the establishment of just trees and forages and livestock on the same land unit, and this is also a very popular practice. Windbreaks, the one we are all very familiar with here in Nebraska, are just like single or multiple rows of trees or shrubs which are in linear configurations, and we have different configurations of this. We will talk about that very briefly. I think maybe I should just stay here. All right, so I like this statement that a bird in hand is worth more than what 2 in the bush. And I take it in a very scientific way, as in one of the first shocks that I had concerning agroforestry was just how many terms are out there when it gets to just describing what agroforestry is. I got confused the very first time that I picked up the Forest Action Plan, and I'll talk very briefly about what that is, of some of the states here in the US. And being an agroforester, I was, of course, looking for agroforestry somewhere. And what I realized was that, so there are several terms that are used to depict agroforestry or describe agroforestry. But at the end of the day, in all those documents, people never really mentioned agroforestry. So my first indication or inclination was that, okay, then how do we know how much agroforestry is being done? Because I think that it's always good to know just how much you have, before you kind of just reach out to see, how much you can get. That's why I said I made that statement. So the first thing, and this is a very good tool. I think they may have recently updated it, but the National Agroforestry Center, which is, just surprise, is here on East Campus. They have a very good tool that basically tells us where in the United States is using a particular agroforestry practices. And you can take some time to look on their website to get some more information. But when it comes to alley cropping, So basically all the highlighted states are those that have reported some usage of it. So this is specific to some federal programs like CRP or EQIP that is being used by producers or landowners in all these places. But it's a very good first step to tell us how much agroforestry is being used in all the states. So if you look at alley cropping, you can look at all these states. Then when you move on multi-story cropping, which is now forest farming, these are the states that are using that. And it also gives you an indication of just how prevalent or how much all of those practices are being used in the US. So of course, riparian forest buffers, like all the states are using it. So it means that it's one of the most popular practices, compared with what we looked at previously. I think that was, okay, we'll just keep going. I think that was alley cropping. Silvo pasture establishment, as I mentioned, is also a very popular practice as well. Then we have, okay, so always. Okay, so windbreak establishment is also a very popular one here in the US. It's only like, surprise, only Alabama that never reported any windbreaks. But yeah, sad. Anyways. Okay, so let me first talk about my baby project. That's how I call it, because that's like basically the first thing that I ever started working on when I got here. So talking about terminologies and forest action plans. So forest action plans are basically the go-to forestry Bible, if you will, for all the states. So I think this morphed from the 2008 Farm Bill, where they basically told all the states to put together some kind of a statewide document just to indicate the status of their forest and any plans or any actions they are taking, any like measures that they are taking to protect their forest lands and stuff like that. So I think in 2010, all the states had theirs done. Then in 2015, they did their first update. And in 2020, they did another update. So I think in 2025, they're going to do another update as well. It's going to go in those 5-year cycles in terms of updating them. But this was when I moved here, the Nebraska Forest Service were in the process of updating this document. So I had a lot of time with this Forest Action Plan of Nebraska. And what I realized was that, of course, I was excited to see that they actually used agroforestry in their Forest Action Plan. But that idea of wanting to know just how much agroforestry is out there came back to my mind, and I decided to look at other states' forest action plans and basically tease out how much agroforestry that they've actually mentioned in those forest action plans. So that was my first project, or my first idea when I came here. So the idea was to just streamline the use of agroforestry. I mean, if we are talking about agroforestry strictly, what are the suite of terms that are used officially, and officially in quotes, because I've not finished with this work. I have a student, Kiani David, who's working on this right now. So we want to see what the preliminary data is going to tell us. Then we'll know whether it's even worth it or, probably not. We'll see. But once we've streamlined those terminologies, then we can, sit down with some of these like statewide, foresters and something like that, just to discuss with them the need to really streamline the kind of terms that we are using to depict what agroforestry is, and it's not in, especially the forest action plans. Of course, there are other documents, other forestry manuals, but this is like the go-to document when you talk about forestry in all the states. So the last would be to just make some recommendations on how we can use agroforestry to help, forest conservation or forestry in general in all those states. So my insidious plan is to kind of get agroforestry have some kind of a standalone section in all these forest action plan. And I'm excited that, for Nebraska, John Erickson agreed. And so, yeah, hooray, we're able to get that in the latest update, a standalone agroforestry section in the Nebraska Forest Action Plan. So this was just to give you an idea of the kind of terms that we are using. And you can see that there's a suite of them. Some of them I had never heard about before, but some too I've heard about. People talk a lot about permaculture and stuff like that. And, so it's not that simple. Like if you see maybe one of these terms being used in the Forest Action Plan, you don't necessarily, come to the conclusion that it's agroforestry. You have to read in depth and actually find out what it means. And Kiani is unfortunately the one having to do that. But it's going well so far. But basically what we did was to maybe collect a suite of terms or how people describe agroforestry, and basically use Adobe. It has a very robust search tool to search for all these terms and basically go through page 1 to the end of it. Some of them are really huge documents, like 300 pages plus. And so that's my little baby project. We'll see where that gets us to. But basically, this is like a very quick snapshot of some of the terms and just how many times. So yeah, just counts. Whenever like we see a term, we look at the term in depth and come up with a kind of metric or conclusion that, okay, this is agroforestry based on how they described it. Then we'll give them like a point for it, and we keep going on. And so, for all these states that have done so far, I think Kiani has gone beyond this, but this was like the first ones that I tried out with, and you can see what's going on here. Like most of them are not even referenced in agroforestry. Some of them are not referenced in agroforestry at all. And all the other terms, like some of them are not even using at all. So all the red are terms that are not being used, and all the basically highlighted or the non-red ones are all the terms that are being used here. So, these are just how many states? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 states. So if we talk about just even the lower 48 alone, that's a lot to go through. But I think it would be a cool kind of result to have, or data to have, that we can use that as a recommendation going forward. So as I said, we have that agroforestry section in the Nebraska Forest Action Plan. So you can take some time to just read it. It's not like, I believe that we can maybe improve it going forward, but having it in there alone is a big victory that I like to talk about. So take some time to just look at it. Okay, so project 2, this was some work that I was involved in with folks at the Nebraska, the National Agroforestry Center, which is on East Campus, as I said. So we looked at windbreaks, kind of going back to that same statement that I made about, a bird in hand. We've come to the conclusion that a lot of people talk about practices that resemble agroforestry, but don't necessarily call it agroforestry. So one of the things that we did, and we are going to do this for all the practices. So we've done it for windbreaks, we've done it for silver pasture. I'll share some of the findings so far in this talk. But basically what we were doing was to do some kind of a systematic review of all producer reported like benefits and challenges towards windbreaks in the United States. So we're looking at what the benefits and challenges, as I said, and are they satisfied? Are those producers satisfied with their plantings, and are they keeping them? Because that's one thing. I talked about all those 4 I's. It's not just a matter of just planting the windbreaks and just trees. They will grow by themselves. So who cares? It's a lot of effort to keep them alive and keep them being useful. So what windbreak maintenance and management activities are producers reporting, and some primary drivers affecting the willingness or intent to adopt windbreaks. So as I mentioned earlier, there are various configurations of windbreaks. It kind of depends on what you want to use it for. So if we are talking of like field windbreaks, you're talking more of like outgrown windbreaks just to protect like croplands, like we see in this picture. Then we have livestock windbreaks, because kind of self-explanatory. They're also protecting wildlife in this case, like we see in this situation. And we can also configure it in a way that we are protecting either a homestead or a farmstead. And all these have different kind of specifications on how to plant your trees and just basically get them as functional as possible. So how we did this was to look through a lot of literature on just windbreaks alone in the United States. And we kind of delved into that path of kind of finding which terms or how people describe windbreaks in general here in the US. And of course, there are also some keywords there, windbreak, shelter belt, those are the usual suspects, but we also have hedgerows, vegetative environmental buffers, timber belts, leaving snow fence, and agroforestry in general. So in this case, we look at, some people just refer to some of these things as agroforestry. So we have to go in there and basically like tease apart, oh, this person is talking about, windbreaks or not. And we looked through a lot of these peer-reviewed databases and also did some kind of gray literature search as well. So what we found was that most of the surveys, so we put together all the studies that we put together. We looked at the various surveys that have been done about like producer reported benefits of windbreaks in the US. And unsurprisingly, we found that, in our range of the world, we had a lot of studies that had talked about how producers perceive windbreaks in general. And so there's no surprises there. But also, another problem that we see here is that when you, for instance, take that map that I showed you about which practice is being used where, we saw that for windbreaks, it covered the whole United States. But when you're looking at research, peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed work, we didn't find anything from some of these other states, which tells you that there's something definitely going on. And it's good to know for sure how much agroforestry is being used in these states so that we can make prescriptions. Which people are using them? How are they calling it? So once we know that, we can use that as some kind of a foundation to build upon and just basically help promote agroforestry in all these states. So it's just a snapshot of the surveys that we encountered in our study. What we found out was that, and this is specific to Nebraska, was that 62 farmers reported yield increases due to windbreak use. And it's also one of the things that we struggle with in terms of advocating for agroforestry. There's very limited research on some of the benefits of these. Like people talk about them in very general terms. So it's a whole, I'll use that term again, Pandora's box when it comes to research into these things. And so I'm excited because I think there's a lot of opportunity for various types of research on how beneficial agroforestry or agroforestry practices are and will be going forward, especially looking at climate change now. And of course, the bulk of people said that they had increases. Some said they had no effect at all. Others said like they had yield decreases actually. Then some biophysical studies with windbreaks, crop yields and windbreaks, saw that there was about 10%. So these are like more kind of empirical because like these are more like self-reported, like, there's no indication of how they really did all those measurements. Like, okay, they experienced, or they, at least in the survey, they confirmed that they had yield increases. So once the farmer reported that, we took that as like some kind of a vote count for yes or no, or maybe didn't, something like that. But empirical research or data shows that about up to 16% increases in yields of soybean and wheat to be expected if you use windbreaks, and also just yield gains of about up to 56% when crops are protected by windbreaks in general. Of course, this is old, so some of these things will need to be worked on again because it's just how research is, I believe. It's good to revisit some of these old studies and basically confirm or maybe dispute whatever they did. Yeah. So in terms of top ranked producer reported benefits of windbreaks, we have all the first ranking here, and all these are from different studies. Of course, soil erosion was there, soil erosion control as we know it in this part of the world. Of course, some just like the view of it, and that was also reported. And this auto reduction is actually a very interesting area, which has gathered a lot of steam in recent times. And there's evidence to indicate that windbreaks actually reduce autos. Especially for those who have hogs and yeah, I was going to say something unscripted, but anyways, anything that will create some kind of odor that people need to reduce. Windbreaks or trees in general have been found scientifically. We are actually putting another kind of workbook together, and we are looking at a lot of these studies internationally that have looked into this subject of odor reduction, and it's amazing how much trees also help with that. But of course, all these importance, all these benefits that I'm talking about comes with very good, basically prescriptions on how to plant these trees, the spacing, the type of trees to use, and stuff like that. So it's not as simple as, oh, I'm gonna do agroforestry and I just go out and just plant maybe a row or two of trees and call it good. It takes a lot of attention, a lot of management prescriptions to follow to really achieve those goals. So it's not as simple as it seems. And of course, wind protection is there, soil erosion, livestock protection. All these are things that we've spoken about already. But it's good to just take a look at some of these benefits, just to give you that range of uses that people just plant windbreaks for. I thought it was interesting to see carbon storage in there, but I think it's just the assumption that to have trees in your agricultural landscape, of course, you're helping with that kind of carbon sequestration bit a little bit. But yeah, I thought it was a very cool finding. If you're interested, I would say just take another look at it. Okay, so reasons for windbreak removal, of course. We also saw this very significantly in some of the studies. And people have very good reasons why they couldn't stick with the windbreaks, and they actually had to remove them. And number one on there was conflict with irrigation. And you see here a picture here, and I believe it was Nebraska. Basically, what we saw was that some of these windbreaks were being torn apart just to fit some of this center pivot irrigation systems, and people have good reasons for wanting to do that. And of course, sometimes to just poor conditions. So the thing about all these, kind of how they call them, these CRPs and EQIP is that they help you. You have to be on top of it. There are certain recommendations. There are certain things that need to be put in place to keep the program running for each and every farmer who subscribes to it. And so I personally believe that the motivation should be beyond just that kind of cost share component that is in there, because there are benefits in the long run to the farmer that are not put in that document, that agreement that is being made. There are lots of benefits, of course, being mindful of just our environment in general shouldn't be like at the cost of just, there shouldn't be a value on it. You know, if this cost share program is no longer running, then it means I'm no longer interested in this particular program anymore. But that, I know that gets a little bit, you know, complicated, and I can get myself in trouble for saying some of these things. But it's just my thought that, you know, things like you need to be oiling that federal machine to get that kind of cost share program running. Why don't you take it upon yourself? But I mean, I could get into trouble. I see how Dave is looking at me, you know, as I say that. But it's just my thought on it. But just to also emphasize the fact that there are people who go into agroforestry or do these plantings because they know the value, you know. So it's one thing for us, I think it's our responsibility to also educate the public on how important, you know, getting trees into these agricultural landscapes is. You know, then still, I'm pretty sure these kind of cost share programs will be running, but it will be very like complementary to those efforts. I think maybe I've made my point clear, so I'm not going to get myself in trouble. Okay, all right. So there are some other reasons, you know, age and poor condition, and get into that problem with management, crop competition, age and condition, several issues here, snow drift issues. So if the windbreak is, you know, planted very well, you shouldn't be running into this issue, you know, because sometimes it's designed specifically to, you know, just direct snow. And so if it's not done correctly, you're going to have issues. That's the thing about, you know, windbreaks, and in fact, all those agroforestry practices. Okay, so in conclusion, you know, producers most value windbreaks for those kind of indirect economic benefits from agriculture, followed by, of course, the direct benefits as well. And they are also dependent. So we looked at all those three types of windbreaks. So the benefits vary based on which kind of configuration you're talking about. And it's in terms of removal, we saw the table on the conflict with irrigation systems and crop competition and other things. And on the whole, we can say that, or you can conclude that producer satisfaction of windbreaks is very high in the U.S. It's 72 to 99%. I'm guessing that's good. I think, you know, if you get 72 on a, yeah, that's not that good. But anyways, if you hit 80s plus, you know, I think you're all good. So in general, I would say that there's that kind of producer satisfaction of windbreaks, and it's mostly inhibited by lack of land. And this goes back to that earlier slide that I talked about, that misconception that, you know, some land is being moved from agricultural land to planting trees, and some people just don't really understand that part very well. There's always that problem. So, but generally, people report it like lack of land and concerns over maintenance, like long-term maintenance of windbreaks. And some people think that, you know, when we talk about the Dust Bowl and whatnot, like, you know, it's a thing of the past. But I don't think so. I think, you know, it's one of my so I have a wild imagination. I wanted to be an astronaut, you know, when I was growing up, for instance. And one of the things that I thought about here, wouldn't it be cool, you know, to actually maybe plant, you know, windbreaks using drones, for instance, just to help, you know, with all the kind of mini Dust Bowl events that we have. And one happened in 2018. I'm sure a lot has happened even before and after this. But there was a pileup on I-80, and it was basically a dust storm that created that. And we know windbreaks really help with that. And so, you know, with climate change and all the predicted increases in some of these weather events, I think it's crucial that we consider windbreaks as some kind of biological control mechanism for some of these things. Okay, so project 3, I'm going to breeze through this one also. So basically, we did everything that we did, the same thing that we did for windbreaks. By this time, we looked at silvopasture. And as I said, we're going to do it for all the 5 practices. So silvopasture is also another really interesting and kind of complicated one to look at as well. But we kind of did the same thing, just remove the windbreaks from the whole like statement and put in silvopasture. And what we came up with, this one of the authors, for those who know Gary, as a landscape architect, he was able to put together a very nice figure to basically summarize everything that we did. I thought it was so cool. So what we found out was, of course, we're trying to tease apart all the primary effects or benefits. You can look at the photo abstract here, and it will give you basically everything that we did. But some of the things that came up in terms of benefits that we get from silvopasture. So we're talking about what? Forage, we're talking about trees at the same time, and of course, livestock, if I forgot that one. But forage, the key components in that system, we are talking about forage, livestock, and trees. Of course, if you're having them in that kind of system, of course, there are several benefits that we are most likely going to get from that. And I'll talk through some of these very briefly. So it maintains or enhances forage yield and quality. If you have, a lot of this is in comparison with, just having the forage alone as a system, which is good. But we are just trying to say that if you have trees in there, it changes that balance, and your forage yield will actually go up. Not to mention that you have your trees, serving as that kind of diverse portfolio in terms of whatever you have on the land. And your livestock also, they are doing better. And we'll look at some of the reasons why I'm saying that. So forage yield and quality increases. You extend your forage growing season if you have trees in your forage system or in a silvopasture system. You have shade trees. Last time I checked, they provide shade. I don't know, but last time I checked, I saw that. And they help with solar radiation, of course, and heat stress. Animals are living beings, and this helps with just animal productivity in general. So the next is thermal protection during winter as well. Get into that. Oh, God. Okay, and weight gain. So this is one of the few instances where weight gain is like very, very well looked at, whichever way you want to say. Of course, we're interested in that in a silvopasture system or with our livestock. So that's also one of the core ingredients we get from including those trees in those systems. Of course, so I talked about diversification, diversity being something of life. But once you have other components to look to, especially if for some reason maybe all your livestock die or something like that, that's never going to happen, hopefully. But you can sell probably maybe your forage, or you can sell maybe some of the trees as well. That is if you did your job well in that silvopasture system. Because if you did it, anyway, I'm talking about livestock dying and talking about managing well. Anyways, you have that increase diversification. Then it can also augment livestock diets. You can supplement or just add some of these acorns and just pods and apples into the diet of your livestock. Then we have soil carbon storage also. It's increased at various levels in the soil when you have a silvopasture system. I talked about that already. Soil carbon, nutrient cycling. Of course, if you have trees, you have a lot of biological elements falling onto the ground and helping with this. Then water infiltration is also slightly higher in silvopasture than open pasture. Then biodiversity also, of course, if you have trees, you most likely see some other wildlife in those areas as well. Then fuel load also, if it's done very well, you reduce your fuel load and decrease the probability of fires or wildfire in general. Then cultural ecosystem services for those who have those kind of intrinsic values being attached to trees in general. It's also good as an ecosystem service as well. So yeah, these are, let's see, I think that was probably my last slide. Yeah, but you can go through all the key benefits that I showed as those that were reported by producers, and some of the challenges that they are facing. Also, lack of information is very, so for all the agroforestry practices, we have this really being emphasized a lot about lack of information. We don't even know what it is. How do we start it? If you're interested in that and whatnot. So a lot of these challenges really are things that I think about every day, and that's why I'm interested in agroforestry. Of course, I'm interested in forestry in general, urban forestry, and other things. But as you heard from the intro, I've kind of, tested a lot of waters, in terms of like the ecological aspect of forestry and more of like the human dimensions or the social aspect of that. Because my thought is that you can't remove human beings or the social component out of, the whole like, kind of biophysical, ecological aspect of just, environmental conservation, if you will. So I always like to look at the two together. So sometimes I'm more inclined towards the social dimensions or the human dimensions. Sometimes too, I go towards the ecological part as well. So if you have any ideas based on what I've told you and all the resources that I pointed you to, you can just come find me in 416 and we can talk further on it. I have some irons here, in the fire at this point. I'm just waiting a bit to get them to really cook before I take them out. But for now, I think I'll leave you guys with this. If you have any questions, I'm more than, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I think I left a lot of time for questions. So, okay. Did I use up all the time? Wow. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. Please. Yeah, please. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. My question, a couple of things that I kind of expected to see on the benefits, but didn't. One would be a hydrological benefit, either in terms of soil moisture or evapotranspiration. And another would be pollination. Can you say something about those from your surveys or from the literature?
Yeah, maybe I did not like say them specifically, but it's one of the core things, benefits of agroforestry in general. And I think we really get into the hydrological side of things when we talk a lot about the riparian forest buffers, for instance. But it's also really a core benefit that we get from these agroforestry systems. Of course, I'm not going to say that farmers do not know what pollinators are. They do know it. But these were surveys that we did specifically targeting those kind of practices that I talked about. Like, so these are just windbreaks and silvopasture, and so farmers. I believe we did get some mention of pollination at some point, but they were not like, there were few farmers who were able to tell us that, and of course they'll talk about helping with water and stuff like that, infiltration, for instance, but they wouldn't go into the depth of it, like, help, like talking about the whole hydrological cycle. That's going to be a little bit too scientific, but we did pick pieces from it. And all the literature that we have also depicts or points to the fact that agroforestry really helps with all that you mentioned. Actually, Gary Benthorpe, I don't know if you know him, he has a whole publication linking pollinators to agroforestry that you can look at. But it's also one of the main things that we know or appreciate about having those trees and those agricultural landscapes.
Okay, thanks.
there's another question behind you.
Have you done any like international development work, particularly like looking at mangroves before you kind of started focus? It seems like your study area is more on the United States.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I wrote a whole dissertation about agroforestry in Ghana. Do you have time?
I
I've also worked on agroforestry in Liberia as well.
I did some work in Africa in my master's on oil palm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and tenure rights. So a
Yeah.
little bit familiar, but
Yeah.
not probably as much as anywhere near you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, the thing is that, so I really was very intentional not to get into tropical systems, because that becomes more, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but that becomes more interesting when you're talking about agroforestry, because you have more diversification in those agroforestry systems. So what I worked on for my dissertation, for instance, was a cocoa agroforest. You can't imagine the number of things, on just an acre of land, looking at, various levels, strata of, just cocoa, agricultural crops, fruit crops, trees, of course, of various sizes. It's amazing when we get there. And also, I need to also point out that there are very different objectives when it comes to like tropical. I can speak for Ghana and maybe Liberia, for instance. I mentioned that misconception that here there's always that notion that agroforestry is permanent transition from agricultural land to forest lands. So when you get into some of the tropics, that is actually true. That is actually true. There is a transition, and it's actually I'll throw this in. So for instance, you can look this up. They have the Tonja system, which was an agroforestry system. But what it does is that they pick degraded forest lands, and to reforest them, they allow access. Of course, access and land tenure in the tropics is very different from here. So the government or whoever is managing the land will allow farmers into the forest, the degraded forest reserves, to farm. So the only condition or the only arrangement is that you can farm, but and get all your crops and everything and take them out. But as soon as one second, you will plant trees also at the same time. So of course trees grow. So as soon as the canopy covers, and you don't have any croplands anymore or land to put your crops in, then you move from there. So we want our trees ultimately, but we'll allow some agriculture to happen at the same time. So that's a very different system. So that takes us into a whole, discussion by itself. Yeah, and thanks for pointing that out. I didn't want to talk about that because I can get very carried away about those systems. It was, nicer to talk about, unfortunately.